Picture this: a dimly lit monastery in the heart of medieval Europe, where rows of robed figures sit in silence, their eyes closed, their lips moving faintly. But they aren't praying, they aren't chanting, they're walking mentally, at least through vast, imaginary palaces, each room filled not with furniture, but with knowledge. These monks were the guardians of an ancient art, a superpower of the mind so potent it could hold entire libraries within the folds of memory. This was the world of memory palaces, a technique so refined it allowed them to preserve centuries of wisdom without writing a single word. And yet today, this extraordinary skill has nearly vanished, leaving us to wonder, how did they do it? And what can we learn from their forgotten mastery? Think about the sheer weight of what they achieved. In an age before printing presses, before cheap parchment, even before widespread literacy, these monks became living repositories of history, philosophy, and sacred texts. They didn't just memorize, they constructed intricate mental landscapes, placing every idea, every quote, every intricate theological argument in a specific location, as if stacking books on invisible shelves. A hallway might hold the works of Aristotle, a garden could bloom with verses from the Psalms, and with each mental stroll, they could retrieve any piece of knowledge at will, as effortlessly as plucking a book from a shelf. This wasn't just memorization, it was an art form, a science of the mind that blurred the line between imagination and reality. But here's the twist: this isn't just a relic of the past. The secrets of memory palaces are still alive, hiding in plain sight. Modern cognitive scientists have rediscovered what these monks knew centuries ago, that our brains are wired for spatial memory, that we remember best when we attach ideas to places, to images, to stories. And yet, in a world drowning in digital information, we've lost touch with this ancient wisdom. So today, we're going to step into those shadowed monastery halls, to walk those mental corridors alongside the monks who once dominated the art of memory. We'll uncover how they built their palaces, why this technique was so powerful, and how you can harness its principles to unlock your own mind's potential. This is more than a history lesson. It's an invitation to rediscover a lost key to intellectual freedom. Are you ready to begin the journey? The roots of memory palaces stretch back much further than those medieval monastery walls, all the way to ancient Greece, where the technique was born not from spiritual devotion, but from sheer necessity. Legend tells of a poet named Simonides who narrowly escaped a collapsing banquet hall, only to realize he could recall every guest's seating position by visualizing the room. That moment of tragedy sparked a revelation. Our minds cling to spaces and images far more fiercely than abstract facts. By the time Rome rose to power, orators like Cicero had turned this insight into a polished art, using imaginary villas to store speeches worth thousands of words. But when the Roman Empire fell, it was the monks who rescued this tool from oblivion, transforming it into something far grander than its creators ever envisioned. What made their approach unique wasn't just the scale, it was the sacred purpose behind it. For these medieval scholars, memory wasn't merely a practical skill, it was a form of worship. They saw the mind itself as a cathedral, with every memorized psalm or theological argument becoming a brick in its walls. Walk through any monastery, and you'd find physical spaces designed to mirror their mental ones. Cloisters became filing cabinets for scripture. Herb gardens stored medicinal knowledge like living encyclopedias. Even the stained glass windows served dual purposes. Their vibrant scenes weren't just decorations, but memory triggers, embedding biblical stories directly into the monks' minds through color and light. This was memory as architecture, where every thought had its place, every idea its dwelling. Yet the true brilliance lay in how they adapted the ancient method of loci to their needs. Where Roman senators might populate their mental halls with symbols of politics or war, monks filled theirs with images of startling vividness, sometimes beautiful, often bizarre. A passage from Augustine's writings might be anchored by a glowing dove perched on a lectern. A complex theological debate could be symbolized by two angels locked in chess match. The more unusual the image, the sharper it stuck in memory, turning dry texts into mental spectacles that were impossible to forget. And because these palaces were built in the limitless space of imagination, they could expand endlessly, every new text, every copied manuscript adding another wing, another story to the structure. This wasn't just clever, it was revolutionary. In a world where parchment was scarce and literacy rare, these mental libraries allowed knowledge to survive wars, plagues, and the slow erosion of time. While external libraries burned, the monks' inner ones remained intact, passed down through generations like an invisible chain of wisdom. Their method proved so effective that even today, memory champions use these very techniques to perform feats that seem superhuman, memorizing decks of cards in minutes, reciting pi to thousands of digits. Yet none have matched the monks' most astonishing achievement, not just storing knowledge, but weaving it into the fabric of their daily lives, until remembrance became as natural as breathing. What's left now are echoes, fragments of their techniques lingering in psychology textbooks, in the routines of competitive memorizers. But the deeper lesson remains. In an age drowning in digital noise, where we outsource memory to devices, the monks remind us that true mastery begins within. Their palaces weren't just storage, they were sanctuaries, proof that the human mind, when trained, can hold universes. And perhaps that's the most enduring legacy of all. Not the texts they preserved, but the revelation that our own minds might still have undiscovered rooms waiting to be unlocked. Imagine standing at the entrance of your childhood home. You know every nook, every creaky floorboard, the exact pattern of sunlight through the kitchen window at dawn. Now picture placing a single, glowing object on the dining table, a golden apple, perhaps, with a verse from the Bible etched into its skin. This was the monks' first step in building a memory palace, anchoring knowledge to the places they knew by heart. Their monasteries weren't just buildings, they were blueprints for the mind, each corridor and chapel a scaffold for storing wisdom. The process was deceptively simple, yet required extraordinary discipline. A monk might begin by closing his eyes and tracing a familiar path, say, from the scriptorium to the refectory. Along that route, he'd mark specific loci, or locations, a candle niche, a carved wooden bench, the iron hinges on a heavy door. Then came the magic. To remember a passage from the Book of Psalms, he wouldn't just rehearse the words, he'd conjure an image so striking it burned into his memory. Maybe a chorus of angels singing from the candle's flame, their voices weaving the sacred text into the very air. The stranger the vision, the better. A mundane quote about humility might become a tiny elephant kneeling before a mouse forever parked by the monastery's well. This wasn't random whimsy, it was neuroscience avant la lettre. Modern research confirms what these monks intuited. Our brains are terrible at recalling raw information, but exceptional at remembering spaces and stories. By tying abstract concepts to vivid spatial cues, they exploited the hippocampus, the brain's GPS, turning dry texts into multisensory experiences. A 15th century Benedictine might spend weeks meticulously placing hundreds of these mental bookmarks, each one a trigger. Need Augustine's thoughts on free will? Take a left at the fountain where a bronze stag debates a wolf beneath the oak tree. The system was fail-proof because it mimicked how memory naturally works, not as a filing cabinet, but as a sprawling, interconnected city. Yet the true genius lay in the layers. Like a cathedral with hidden chapels, advanced practitioners nested memories within memories. A single fresco in their mental monastery might contain a dozen symbols, each unlocking deeper knowledge when examined closely. A depiction of the Last Supper could house Aristotle's logic in the folds of the tablecloth, or medical herb lore in the disciples' outstretched hands. Over years, these palaces grew into vast mental libraries, with entire wings dedicated to specific subjects, all navigable with the certainty of a sleepwalker moving through their own home. What's astonishing isn't just the scale, but the fluidity. Unlike modern note-taking apps with rigid folders, these were living systems. A monk could rearrange his mental furniture on the fly, shifting a theological debate from the garden to the bell tower if the original location grew crowded. The palaces also adapted to their builders' evolving understanding. Revisiting a locus after months might reveal new connections, as if the memory itself had matured like wine in a cellar. This wasn't rote memorization, it was an ongoing conversation with knowledge where every review deepened the imprint. Consider the humility in their approach. Today, we externalize memory cloud storage, sticky notes, voice memos, as if distrusting our own minds, but these monks treated memory as sacred cultivation. They didn't just stash information, they tended it like gardens, pruning dead branches and grafting new growth. A 12th century Cistercian might spend his morning walk mentally tending his palace, reinforcing weak images, discarding outdated ones, leaving offerings of attention at each locus. The discipline bordered on spiritual exercise, a daily reaffirmation that true wisdom wasn't just acquired, but woven into the very fabric of thought. The lesson for us isn't about recreating medieval techniques verbatim. It's about recognizing that memory, at its best, is creative, spatial, and deeply personal. In an age of endless tabs and forgotten passwords, the monks remind us that retention flourishes when knowledge has a home, a place in the mind's eye where it can breathe, grow, and await our return. Their palaces stand as ruins now, but the architecture remains, proof that the human brain, when given the right tools, can build cathedrals. For the medieval monk, memorization was never just about storage. It was an act of devotion, a sacred dialogue with the divine. When they committed scripture to memory, they weren't merely reciting words, they were etching God's voice into the very architecture of their souls. The Benedictine rule made this explicit, instructing monks to listen with the ear of the heart, transforming rote memorization into a form of prayer. Every psalm internalized, every parable woven into their mental palaces became a stepping stone toward spiritual enlightenment, as if each memorized line brought them closer to touching the hem of heaven's robe. This practice drew from an ancient Christian belief that memory was a mirror of the soul's purity. Augustine himself wrote that the mind was a vast inner chamber where one could commune with God directly, no priest, no parchment, just the silent exchange between creator and created. Monks took this idea further, treating their memory palaces as sanctuaries where sacred texts didn't just reside but lived. Imagine a Cistercian brother pacing the cloister at dawn, lips moving not in hurried repetition, but in slow reverence as he placed Christ's parables in the arches above him. To him, those mental vaults weren't metaphors, they were as real as the stone walls around him, perhaps more so, for they held truths no fire could destroy. The physicality of their technique deepened this spiritual dimension. By assigning scripture to specific locations, a verse from Isaiah nestled in the curve of a stairwell, a gospel passage glowing above a chapel door, they blurred the line between the earthly and the eternal. It was as if their monasteries existed in two realms at once, the tangible one of mortar and candlelight, and the invisible one where every corner hummed with divine wisdom. This wasn't just study, it was a kind of mystical cartography, mapping the divine onto the geography of the mind. Even the act of forgetting held theological weight. When a monk struggled to recall a passage, it wasn't merely a lapse, it was a call to humility, a reminder that human memory, like all things earthly, was imperfect. The very effort to rebuild a fading memory became an exercise in spiritual discipline, a miniature echo of humanity's struggle to retain divine truth amid life's distractions. And when a locus finally crystallized in their mind, when a verse once elusive now sprang forth effortlessly, it felt like grace, a small miracle affirming their devotion. This sacred approach to memory reveals a stark contrast to our modern relationship with knowledge. Today, we treat information as disposable, skimming surfaces without sinking roots. But the monks remind us that true understanding demands embodiment, not just knowing a text, but housing it within oneself until it reshapes how we see, how we pray, how we breathe. Their memory palaces weren't just storage units, they were altars, proving that the deepest learning has always been an act of love. Monasteries didn't just store knowledge, they were living, breathing classrooms where memory palaces became the ultimate teaching tool. Imagine a young novice arriving at Cluny Abbey in the 12th century, wide-eyed and eager. His education wouldn't begin with parchment and ink, but with a mental exercise as rigorous as physical labor. Day after day, he'd train his mind like a muscle, learning to construct intricate memory palaces under the watchful eye of a master. These weren't shortcuts, they were mental scaffolds, carefully built to hold everything from Gregorian chants to the tangled debates of early church fathers. The curriculum was relentless. Before touching a single manuscript, novices mastered the art of visualization, turning abstract concepts into vivid, tangible forms. A lesson on the Trinity might involve placing 3 interlocking rings in the monastery's imaginary courtyard, each one glowing with a different hue. The 7 deadly sins could become grotesque figures lurking in the refectory's shadows, pride as a peacock preening on the abbot's chair, sloth as a snail oozing across the bread table. This wasn't just creative play, it was cognitive engineering designed to exploit the brain's knack for recalling images and spaces far better than raw text. What's striking is how democratizing this system was. In an era when books were priceless treasures, locked away in scriptoria, memory palaces put knowledge within reach of anyone willing to train their mind. A lowborn novice with no access to parchment could still carry entire texts in his head, retrieving them at will. This mental egalitarianism allowed monasteries to become Europe's de facto universities, where social status mattered less than the discipline of one's thoughts. A well-trained memory could vault a shepherd's son into theological debates alongside nobles, provided he'd built his palace with enough rooms to hold the wisdom. The real marvel was how these techniques preserved antiquity's greatest works. While war and time crumbled Rome's libraries, monks silently safeguarded Cicero's speeches in imaginary basilicas, Aristotle's philosophies in mental gardens. A Benedictine copying a crumbling Latin manuscript didn't just transcribe it, he walked through his memory palace, slotting each passage beside related ideas, creating a web of connections no physical book could replicate. When Viking raids sent monks fleeing with little more than their robes, their true wealth wasn't left behind in burning scriptoria. It traveled with them intact in the palaces they'd built behind their eyelids. Yet this system demanded more than mental agility. It required a holistic reshaping of thought. Monks didn't just memorize, they ruminated, chewing over texts until the words dissolved into meaning. A single psalm might occupy a novice for months, placed in his palace's chapel, then revisited daily until its layers unfolded like a flower. This slow, deep engagement stood in stark contrast to today's rapid-fire learning. There were no cram sessions, no highlight reels, just the patient layering of knowledge brick by mental brick. The legacy of this educational alchemy still lingers. Modern memory athletes use similar techniques to perform feats like memorizing shuffled decks of cards in minutes. But the monks' goal wasn't spectacle, it was integration. Their palaces weren't just storage lockers, but greenhouses where knowledge could take root and grow. In an age where we forget passwords within seconds and rely on external drives to remember for us, their approach whispers a provocative question. Have we traded depth for convenience, mistaking the accumulation of information for true understanding? Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in their view of memory as sacred labor. Each mental palace was more than a study aid, it was an act of devotion, a votive offering built neuron by neuron. When a monk spent years memorizing the Book of Job, he wasn't just preparing for a debate. He was constructing a chapel in his mind, a private space where divine and human thought could meet. In our era of disposable facts and endless scrolling, that patient craftsmanship feels almost revolutionary, a reminder that some things are worth remembering slowly, deeply, and with the full weight of our attention. The printing press didn't just revolutionize how books were made, it quietly dismantled a 1,000-year-old tradition of mental architecture. When Johannes Gutenberg's invention began spreading across Europe in the 15th century, it wasn't just parchment that became obsolete. The very need to store entire libraries in one's mind started to feel like a relic. Why spend years constructing intricate memory palaces when the same knowledge could now sit on a shelf, perfectly preserved in ink? Almost overnight, the monk's once indispensable skill began its slow retreat into obscurity, like a fresco fading beneath layers of new paint. But the shift wasn't immediate. At first, scholars treated printed books as supplements to their mental storehouses, not replacements. A theologian might still memorize key scriptures while keeping a printed Bible for reference, much like a modern chef memorizes recipes but keeps a cookbook handy. Over generations, though, reliance on external storage grew. By the 17th century, even monasteries, the last bastions of the old tradition, had largely abandoned the rigorous memory training that once defined their daily routines. The palaces weren't destroyed, they were simply left empty like grand cathedrals after the congregation has drifted away. What's fascinating is how the printing press didn't just change how information was stored, it altered how people thought. When knowledge lives outside the mind, effortlessly retrievable from a page, the brain adapts. The medieval scholar's ability to mentally walk through layers of interconnected ideas gave way to a more fragmented, linear way of processing information. Think of the difference between navigating a city from memory versus following turn-by-turn GPS instructions. One requires deep spatial and relational understanding, the other prioritizes efficiency over immersion. The printing press, for all its wonders, subtly rewired cognition itself. Yet the memory palace never fully vanished. Like an underground river, its principles resurfaced in unexpected places. Renaissance orators like Giordano Bruno still taught elaborate mnemonic systems, though now more for theatrical persuasion than sacred duty. Enlightenment encyclopedists borrowed the monks' organizational tricks, structuring their volumes like physical counterparts to mental loci. Even today, traces linger in everyday language. We file away facts, store memories, search our minds for information. These metaphors are the ghostly echoes of a time when memory wasn't just a function, but a carefully constructed space. The real tragedy of this decline isn't the loss of technique, but the erosion of a certain relationship with knowledge. For medieval monks, memorization was inseparable from meditation. To internalize a text was to let it transform you. The printing press severed that connection, making information abundant but disposable. A modern student might skim a dozen articles in an hour, retaining little. A 12th century novice would spend that same hour etching a single passage into his memory palace, ensuring it became part of him. Neither approach is inherently superior, but the contrast reveals a profound shift in what we consider learning to be. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in the exceptions. A handful of communities, Yiddish storytellers, Islamic hadith scholars, Tibetan Buddhist monks kept oral memory traditions alive long after Gutenberg. Their persistence hints at something the printing press couldn't replicate: the way knowledge, when woven into the fabric of memory, becomes more than information. It becomes wisdom carried in the body as much as the mind. The monks' palaces may lie in ruins, but their central insight endures. That true understanding isn't just about access, but embodiment. And in an age drowning in data but starving for meaning, that's a lesson worth remembering. Centuries after monks paced their cloisters building invisible libraries, modern science has begun to unravel why their methods worked so astonishingly well. In labs from Stanford to Cambridge, researchers have discovered something extraordinary: that our brains are hardwired for spatial memory in ways that defy conventional learning. When functional MRI scans track blood flow in the brain during memory tasks, they reveal the hippocampus, the same region that helps squirrels remember buried nuts, lighting up like a Christmas tree when test subjects use spatial techniques. It turns out that evolution favored minds that could map terrain and recall survival-critical locations, not those designed for rote memorization of abstract lists. The monks didn't just stumble upon a clever trick, they tapped into a fundamental feature of human cognition, one that modern education had largely ignored until now. Consider what happened when University of London researchers taught two groups the same complex medical terminology. One group used traditional flashcards, while the other built memory palaces with vivid imagery, placing, say, the zygomatic arch as a glowing bridge in their childhood home's hallway. The difference was staggering. Weeks later, the palace group recalled nearly twice as much information with significantly less effort. Even more fascinating, their brain scans showed enhanced connectivity between memory and visual processing regions, proof that this ancient technique doesn't just store facts, but physically reshapes how the brain organizes knowledge. This revival isn't confined to laboratories. Across the globe, a subculture of memory athletes has emerged, pushing these techniques to Olympic levels. At the World Memory Championships, competitors perform feats that would make medieval monks nod in approval, memorizing hundreds of random numbers in minutes, decks of shuffled cards in seconds. Yet beneath the spectacle lies a profound truth. These modern mentalists aren't savants, but ordinary people who have mastered the same spatial strategies monks used to preserve entire libraries. Nelson Deleuze, a four-time USA memory champion, trains by placing absurd images in familiar locations. A giant banana playing chess in his grandmother's living room to remember a chessboard sequence. It's the same principle a Benedictine once used to encode Augustine's sermons, just with a 21st century twist. Perhaps the most compelling applications are happening where recall matters most, in hospitals and medical schools. Dr. Sanjay Desai, a Johns Hopkins physician, teaches residents to navigate the complexities of human anatomy using memory palaces. Instead of dry textbooks, students might store the brachial plexus nerve network as a tangled constellation of glowing strings in their imagined childhood treehouse. The results: improved test scores, yes, but more importantly, fewer diagnostic errors in real-world practice. When knowledge isn't just learned but spatially embodied, it becomes instinctive, accessible even under the high-stress chaos of an emergency room. Yet for all its proven power, this ancient art still fights for legitimacy in modern education. Traditional schooling often prioritizes cramming over deep encoding, treating memory as a passive warehouse rather than an active construction site. The irony is palpable. We've never had more scientific validation for the monks' methods, yet they remain on the fringes of mainstream pedagogy. Some forward-thinking institutions are challenging this. The Medical University of Vienna now incorporates memory palace training into its curriculum, reporting not just better retention, but students who find joy in learning again, a faint echo of the medieval monks who saw memorization as sacred play. What makes this rediscovery so thrilling isn't just the validation of old wisdom, but the new frontiers it opens. Modern adaptations are blending ancient techniques with contemporary understanding, using virtual reality to construct limitless memory palaces, or combining loci methods with spaced repetition algorithms. The core insight remains unchanged, that human memory thrives on narrative, on space, on the strange alchemy of imagery and emotion. As we stand amidst the ruins of the monks' mental cathedrals, we're finally beginning to understand why they worked and how we might rebuild them for a world drowning in information but starving for true mastery. The human brain didn't evolve to memorize phone numbers or shopping lists, it evolved to navigate. Picture our ancestors traversing savannas, remembering where to find fresh water, which thickets hid predators, which trees bore fruit. Survival depended on spatial recall, and that legacy is etched into our neural wiring. When monks visualized scripture in imaginary cloisters, or modern memory champions place playing cards along familiar streets, they're hacking this ancient circuitry. The hippocampus, that seahorse-shaped region deep in our skulls, doesn't just guide us through physical spaces, it's the architect of our mental ones, treating remembered locations and imagined ones with equal reverence. This biological quirk explains why memory palaces outperform rote repetition. Abstract information, like dates or formulas, floats in our minds like fog, dispersing quickly. But anchor those facts to a mental location, and suddenly they have weight, texture, permanence. Neuroscientists call this the Baker/Baker paradox. Tell someone to remember that a man's surname is Baker, and they'll likely forget. But ask them to remember that the man is a baker. Picture him dusted in flour, pulling loaves from an oven, and recall soars. The difference: one is a label, the other is a scene, rich with sensory hooks. Memory palaces take this principle further, embedding knowledge not just in images, but in spatial relationships, creating a web of associations no flashcard could match. Modern imaging studies reveal the magic in action. When test subjects construct memory palaces, their brains show synchronized activity between the hippocampus and visual cortex, as if the mind is treating imagined loci as real places. Even more fascinating, the same neurons that fire when you navigate your neighborhood also activate when you traverse mental landscapes. This dual-purpose wiring means every memory palace isn't just a storage trick. It's a cognitive artifact, leveraging millions of years of evolutionary fine-tuning. The implications stretch beyond memorization. London taxi drivers who master the city's labyrinthine streets develop enlarged hippocampi, proof that spatial training physically reshapes the brain. Similarly, seasoned memory palace users don't just recall more, they think differently. Complex ideas become landscapes to explore, arguments transform into paths connecting viewpoints. It's no accident that many great thinkers, from Aristotle to Sherlock Holmes' fictional creator, Arthur Conan Doyle, were ardent practitioners. They understood what science now confirms, that creativity thrives when knowledge isn't just stored, but spatially organized, allowing unexpected connections to emerge like crossroads between mental territories. Yet the true elegance lies in the system's scalability. A beginner might start with their childhood home, placing a dozen vocabulary words along a familiar hallway. But as expertise grows, so does the palace, adding wings, cities, even entire worlds. One modern mnemonist memorized 22,000 digits of pi by visualizing a vast theme park, each digit pair represented by a ride or concession stand. This flexibility mirrors how our ancestors' brains adapted to new environments, suggesting that memory palaces work because they speak the brain's native language: space, story, and survival. What the monks intuited and science now validates is this: forgetting isn't a failure of attention, but a mismatch of method. Our brains aren't broken, we're just feeding them the wrong input. Abstract data slips through like sand, but knowledge tied to spatial and sensory cues becomes part of us, as durable as the memory of your first home's layout, as vivid as the route to water in a primordial forest. The memory palace isn't a shortcut, it's a homecoming, a return to the way our minds were meant to learn. The monks may have perfected the art of memory palaces, but they certainly didn't invent its power. Centuries before cloistered scribes walked their mental corridors, the Roman statesman Cicero was dazzling audiences with speeches lasting hours, all delivered without a single note. His secret, an elaborate memory palace modeled on the grand villas of Rome, where every argument, every turn of phrase had its own room. Legend has it that during one famous trial, Cicero recalled an opponent's entire case by mentally retracing steps through an imaginary house, each room revealing a flaw in the prosecution's logic. For him, these techniques weren't just tools, they were the foundation of eloquence itself, turning the mind into a theater where ideas could be rehearsed, rearranged, and unleashed with precision. Then there was Thomas Aquinas, the medieval theologian whose Summa Theologica contains over 2 million words, a work so vast it said he could recite any section from memory. Aquinas transformed the memory palace into a sacred geometry, structuring his mental spaces like the tiers of Dante's Paradise. Complex theological debates became staircases ascending toward divine truth, with each step representing a counterargument or scriptural reference. His contemporaries whispered that his recall wasn't merely skill but divine inspiration, as if his mind had become a mirror of the mind of God. But no one pushed the boundaries further than Giordano Bruno, the 16th century philosopher who turned memory palaces into cosmic playgrounds. Where others stored texts or speeches, Bruno placed entire universes. His palaces weren't modeled on buildings but on celestial patterns. Zodiac signs became memory rooms. Planets served as loci for philosophical concepts. In his most audacious work, The Shadows of Ideas, he described memory systems so vast they could contain all human knowledge, layered like the spheres of Ptolemaic astronomy. It was breathtakingly ambitious and ultimately dangerous. When Bruno brought these ideas to the Inquisition's attention, his memory techniques were deemed heretical, his mental architectures seen as rivaling God's own design. The very skill that made him famous became evidence of his hubris. What unites these figures across time isn't just their use of memory palaces, but how they adapted the technique to their era's deepest questions. For Cicero in the Roman Senate, it was about mastering the art of persuasion in a world where rhetoric meant power. For Aquinas in the scholastic debates of medieval Paris, it became a way to reconcile faith with reason. For Bruno, standing at the dawn of modern science, it was a tool to map the infinite. Each transformed the method to fit their ambitions, proving that memory palaces aren't rigid templates but flexible frameworks, as adaptable to storing legal arguments as they are to charting the stars. Their legacies reveal an uncomfortable truth about memory in the modern age. We've outsourced recall to devices, trading the mental discipline of a Cicero for the convenience of a search engine. Yet when we read about Bruno reconstructing entire Hermetic texts from memory while imprisoned, or Aquinas composing intricate treatises without reference books, we glimpse a different relationship with knowledge, one where understanding meant internalization, where wisdom wasn't just accessed but embodied. Perhaps that's why these figures still captivate us centuries later. Their feats seem superhuman not because their brains were different, but because they cultivated a skill we've allowed to atrophy, the art of making knowledge truly, deeply our own. Dante's Divine Comedy isn't just a masterpiece of medieval poetry, it's a sprawling, three-dimensional memory palace in verse. Picture the concentric circles of hell, each one meticulously crafted to house specific sins and their punishments. The lustful swirl in an eternal storm, the gluttonous wallow in freezing slush, the treacherous entombed in ice. These aren't just vivid images, they're mental bookmarks designed to sear moral lessons into the reader's mind through spatial and sensory anchors. Dante didn't just describe the afterlife, he built a navigable moral universe where every terrace of purgatory and sphere of heaven became a locus for theological truths. Scholars now suggest the entire work might have functioned as a teaching tool, allowing preachers to walk through its structure during sermons, retrieving allegories as effortlessly as monks once retrieved scriptures from their mental cloisters. Even more striking is how Gothic cathedrals mirrored this principle in stone and glass. Chartres Cathedral's labyrinth wasn't just a decorative floor pattern. It was a pilgrimage route compressed into a single room, meant to be walked while meditating on scripture. The rose windows above, they weren't merely beautiful, they were mnemonic devices, their radiant petals encoding biblical stories in color and light for worshippers who couldn't read Latin. A single stained glass panel might depict the parable of the prodigal son through sequential scenes, guiding the eye from sin to redemption just as Dante's verses did. These architectural marvels were memory palaces in literal form, where every gargoyle, every frescoed saint served as a spiritual waypoint. The tradition extended to illuminated manuscripts, where marginalia teemed with bizarre creatures, rabbits jousting, monks battling snails. These weren't doodles but deliberate memory triggers. A 14th century Psalter might place a grotesque hybrid beast beside a psalm verse about vanity, creating an unforgettable visual pun. The more outlandish the image, the better it stuck, a technique straight from the monk's playbook. Even the layout of texts reinforced this. Pages were often divided into columns and sections like rooms in a palace, with red-lettered initials acting as doorway markers to key passages. Renaissance artists took this further, embedding memory systems into their work. Botticelli's illustrations of Dante's Inferno didn't just depict the poem, they transformed it into a visual memory palace, each circle rendered with such specificity that viewers could mentally reconstruct the entire moral hierarchy. Meanwhile, in the studiolo of Urbino's ducal palace, intricate wood inlays created a physical memory theater, where mythological scenes and scientific diagrams adorned cabinets in a carefully planned order, turning the room itself into a knowledge storage device. What unites these examples is their shared understanding of memory as something architectural. Whether in verse, stone, or pigment, medieval and Renaissance creators designed their works to be traversed, explored, and internalized. They knew what modern neuroscience confirms, that the human mind craves structure, narrative, and spatial anchors. In an age before mass literacy, these were more than artistic choices, they were cognitive lifelines, ensuring complex ideas could survive and spread without reliance on fragile parchment or fleeting speech. The irony is rich. Today we admire these works as aesthetic triumphs, often missing their original purpose as the most sophisticated educational technology of their time, proof that beauty and utility were never meant to be separate. There's a haunting paradox in the way we handle knowledge today. We've never had more information within reach, entire libraries in our pockets, centuries of scholarship a click away. Yet this abundance comes at a cost, the slow erosion of what the monks cherished most, the sacred act of internalizing wisdom. For them, memorizing a text wasn't just about storage. It was a form of alchemy where words transformed through repetition into lived truth. When a Benedictine monk spent months etching Augustine's words into his memory palace, he wasn't just preserving sentences, he was letting them reshape his thoughts, his prayers, his very way of being. Compare that to how we interact with knowledge now, skimming articles while multitasking, bookmarking pages we'll never revisit, retaining just enough to debate but not enough to truly understand. This shift from embodiment to extraction has subtle yet profound consequences. Studies show that when we know information is digitally accessible, we're less likely to remember it, a phenomenon called the Google effect. Our brains treat the internet like an external hard drive, offloading the work of retention. The monks faced the opposite problem. Every fact they wished to keep had to be painstakingly woven into their mental fabric. This forced a kind of intellectual triage. They couldn't afford to memorize everything, so they chose carefully, prioritizing depth over breadth. A 12th century scholar might know fewer texts than a modern undergraduate, but he knew them in a way that bordered on communion, each passage resonating with layers of personal and collective meaning. The ethical dimension emerges when we consider what's lost in this transition. Digital storage democratizes access but risks divorcing knowledge from contemplation. A medieval monk retrieving a quote from his memory palace didn't just recall words, he relived the context. The imaginary stained glass light filtering onto that mental shelf, the emotional state he was in when he placed it there, the connections to other ideas in adjacent loci. This rich, associative recall fostered wisdom rather than mere information. Today, when we search a keyword and instantly retrieve a quote stripped of all context, we gain efficiency but sacrifice the textured understanding that comes from knowledge being deeply nested in the mind's architecture. Perhaps the most poignant loss is the disappearance of knowledge as ritual. For the monks, memorization was daily practice, like tending a garden, reinforcing some memories, pruning others, noticing how ideas matured over time. This slow, cyclical engagement stood in stark contrast to our binge and purge learning culture, where information is crammed for exams then forgotten, or consumed in endless scrolls without integration. The difference isn't just practical, it's existential. When knowledge becomes transactional rather than transformational, we risk reducing education today to transfer, missing the monk's central insight that true learning isn't about possessing facts, but about being reshaped by them. Yet this isn't a call to abandon technology for quill and parchment. The challenge is synthesis, how to harness digital tools without surrendering the depth the monks mastered. Some modern educators are experimenting with hybrid approaches, using apps that employ spaced repetition, encouraging students to build digital memory palaces with virtual reality, or designing curricula that prioritize deep engagement with fewer texts over superficial coverage of many. These experiments hint at a middle path where the efficiency of modern tools serves the ancient goal of embodied understanding. The monk's legacy poses an uncomfortable question. In our relentless pursuit of more information, have we neglected the harder work of meaning? Their memory palaces weren't just storage solutions, they were sanctuaries where knowledge and identity intertwined. As we stand amidst the ruins of that tradition, we're left to wonder, what might we regain if we treated some fraction of our digital abundance with the same reverence, selecting not just what's convenient to know, but what's essential to become. Imagine trying to learn a new language using only flashcards, drilling vocabulary into your brain through sheer repetition. Now picture instead walking through a sunlit marketplace in your mind, where each stall holds not just words but sensations. The spice merchant's cinnamon-scented booth teaches you the word for sweet. The fishmonger's icy counter introduces cold. The clanging coppersmith shop echoes the term for loud. This is the fundamental divide between modern memory tools and the ancient art of memory palaces. Apps like Anki and Quizlet excel at delivering information efficiently, using algorithms to reinforce facts at optimal intervals. But they engage only one lane of cognition, the dry, abstract processing of symbols, while the MONKS method activated entire networks of sensory and spatial recall. The trade-offs are revealing. Digital tools democratize learning, making mastery accessible to anyone with a smartphone. A medical student can review thousands of anatomical terms between bus rides, thanks to spaced repetition software. Yet something vital gets lost in this transaction. Compare that student's experience to a medieval monk memorizing herbal remedies by placing each plant in his mental monastery garden, associating peppermint with the dew-soaked corner by the cloister, feverfew with the sun-warmed patch near the stone bench. For the monk, recall wasn't a chore but a pilgrimage, each piece of knowledge embedded in a rich tapestry of imagined textures, scents, and emotions. Modern science now confirms what he intuited. Memories tied to multisensory cues are far more durable and easier to retrieve under stress, whether that's a monk reciting psalms during a famine or a surgeon recalling anatomy mid-operation. Our educational systems have largely chosen speed over depth, prioritizing how much we can learn rather than how well. A university lecture crams centuries of philosophy into a semester. Language apps promise fluency in weeks. The monks would have found this approach baffling. Their memory training wasn't measured in facts per hour, but in how deeply each idea could be contemplated and interconnected. A single verse might be placed in their palace's chapel for months, revisited daily until it revealed new layers of meaning, a stark contrast to today's binge and purge learning cycles. The irony is painful. We've never had more tools for learning, yet the kind of profound, lasting mastery the monks achieved feels increasingly rare. The most exciting developments today lie in synthesis, bridging ancient wisdom with modern tools. Imagine a language app that doesn't just flash vocabulary cards, but guides you in constructing a virtual memory palace, letting you place French verbs in a Parisian cafe you once visited. Envision medical students using VR headsets to walk through hyper-detailed anatomical memory palaces, where the aortic valve isn't just a diagram but a pulsating structure in a cathedral-like heart chamber. Some innovators are already exploring this fusion. The startup Memorado combines spaced repetition with narrative-based memory journeys, while historians at Cambridge have recreated medieval memory techniques in interactive digital formats. What these experiments share is a recognition that efficiency alone isn't enough. The monk's greatest lesson wasn't about storing information, but about transforming how we inhabit knowledge, making it spatial, sensory, and deeply personal. In a world drowning in disposable facts, their approach whispers a radical alternative. That true learning isn't about how much you can access, but how much you can carry within you, not just in your device, but in your bones. Perhaps the future of memory lies not in choosing between ancient palaces and modern algorithms, but in building bridges between them, creating ways to learn that honor both our technological present and our cognitive ancestry. Before the first sliver of sunlight touched the monastery walls, Brother Alcuin was already awake, his bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. In the pre-dawn darkness, his mind was alight, walking the corridors of a cathedral only he could see. Each morning began the same way, retracing the previous day's additions to his memory palace, reinforcing the psalms he'd placed in the choir stalls, the patristic commentaries shelved in the scriptorium's mental twin. This wasn't mere review, it was a sacred dialogue with the knowledge itself, as if the texts grew richer with each visitation. The rhythm of his day followed an ancient cadence. After prime prayers, he'd spend hours in the physical scriptorium, copying a fragile manuscript of Augustine's letters. But here's where the magic happened. He wasn't just transcribing. With each line inked onto parchment, he was simultaneously constructing a new wing of his mental library. A particularly luminous passage about divine grace might become a stained glass window in his imagined chapel, its colors shifting with the theological nuances. A complex argument about free will transformed into a sculpted debate between two angels on the cloister's imaginary fountain. The physical act of writing and the mental act of encoding were inseparable, two halves of a single devotional practice. Midday brought a different kind of labor. While his hands worked in the herb garden crushing lavender for incense or bundling sage for the infirmary, his mind was pruning and reinforcing. Fading memories were revisited, their imagery made more vivid. A psalm verse that had begun to blur might be relocated from a shadowy corner to a sunlit alcove, or tied to the scent of the thyme beneath his fingers. The monks understood something modern science would later confirm. Multisensory encoding creates the stickiest memories. By evening, even the ache in his lower back from bending over herbs became part of the tapestry, a bodily bookmark ensuring those medicinal recipes would surface when needed most. The true test came during the nightly collatio when the brothers gathered to discuss scripture. While others fumbled with parchment scraps, Alcuin spoke fluidly, quoting Jerome or Gregory the Great with ease. His recall wasn't robotic recitation, but lively engagement, because in his memory palace, these texts weren't frozen words but living encounters. When referencing Christ's parable of the sower, he didn't just recite the lines. He stood again in his mental field, feeling the imagined soil between his fingers, watching the seeds fall where they may. This visceral, spatial relationship with knowledge allowed him to synthesize ideas on the fly, drawing connections between seemingly disparate texts that had been shelved in adjacent mental chambers. What modern observers might miss is how creativity flourished within this discipline. Far from rigid repetition, the monk's memory practice demanded constant innovation. When Alcuin struggled to retain a list of medieval medical humors, he didn't drill harder, he invented. The four temperaments became characters in a mental marketplace, a choleric blacksmith pounding his anvil, a phlegmatic fishmonger dozing by his stall. The more bizarre the imagery, the more indelible the memory. This playful ingenuity blurred the line between memorization and artistry, turning each act of recall into a miniature act of creation. The cumulative effect was transformative. After decades of this practice, a monk's memory palace wasn't just a tool, it was a second mind. Texts absorbed in youth remained vivid in old age, not as dusty relics but as companions weathered by years of mental visitation. When Alcuin taught novices, he didn't just pass on information. He handed them the blueprints of his inner architecture, showing how to build palaces of their own. And in moments of solitude, those palaces became something more, sanctuaries where the boundary between memory and prayer dissolved, where every recalled word was both an act of preservation and an offering. This daily alchemy, turning ink on parchment into gold within the mind, holds a mirror to our own fractured relationship with knowledge. We've outsourced memory to devices, trading depth for convenience. But the monks whisper across centuries with a provocative question. What if true learning isn't about collecting information, but about constructing inner worlds where wisdom can take root and flourish? Their days weren't spent hoarding facts, but cultivating a landscape where every idea had room to breathe, to connect, to transform. In an age of endless scrolling and forgotten bookmarks, that patient craftsmanship feels less like antiquated ritual and more like a radical act of resistance. Think about the last time you truly learned something by heart, not just memorized it for a test or skimmed it for a meeting, but absorbed it so deeply it became part of you. For the medieval monk, this wasn't an occasional achievement, it was the entire rhythm of intellectual life. While we toggle between browser tabs and half-read articles, they spent months, sometimes years, with a single text, letting it seep into their minds like rain into parched soil. A novice might devote an entire season to the Book of Psalms, not just reciting the words but inhabiting them, turning each verse over like a stone in the hand to examine every facet. This wasn't inefficiency, it was a radical kind of depth we've all but forgotten. Consider the physicality of their practice. A monk copying a manuscript didn't rush. Each stroke of the quill was deliberate, the ink mixed by hand, the parchment carefully scraped and prepared. The act of writing itself became a meditation, a way to etch the text into muscle memory as much as mental recall. Modern studies reveal the surprising truth behind this slow approach. The more sensory and motor circuits we engage while learning, the feel of the pen, the sound of scratching parchment, the more robust the memory becomes. When that same monk later retrieved the passage from his memory palace, he wasn't just recalling words, he was reliving the curve of each letter, the weight of the quill, the faint resistance of the vellum. Compare that to our habit of typing notes on glass screens, where every keystroke feels identical and nothing lingers in the hands. The contrast with modern learning couldn't be starker. Today, we measure educational progress in speed, how quickly someone can summarize an article, how many modules they complete per hour. Language apps boast about 15-minute daily lessons, as if fluency were a commute to be shortened. But the monks understood something counterintuitive. Slowing down often means learning faster in the long run. When you spend weeks with a text, you begin to see its hidden architecture, how ideas interlock, where the arguments pivot, what echoes across chapters. This depth of engagement creates what cognitive scientists call chunking, where individual facts fuse into meaningful patterns, making recall effortless and creative synthesis possible. A monk could debate theology not because he'd memorized more quotes, but because he'd lived inside the texts long enough to anticipate their rhythms, like a musician knowing where the melody turns. There's an emotional dimension we often overlook. When learning is stripped of urgency, it becomes relational. A 14th century Benedictine didn't just study the Psalms, he wrestled with them in moments of doubt, whispered them in grief, shouted them in joy. The texts became mirrors for his inner life, and that emotional resonance wired them into his brain far more powerfully than any cram session could. Modern research confirms this. Memories tinged with strong emotion are retained up to 6 times longer than neutral ones. The monk's slow learning wasn't just about retention, it was about integration, letting knowledge marinate until it altered how they saw the world. Perhaps the most profound loss in our shift to speed is the death of productive struggle. The monks embraced difficulty as part of the process. A challenging passage wasn't skipped or summarized. It was circled like a puzzle, revisited at different hours in different moods until it yielded meaning. This aligns with what we now know about desirable difficulties, the counterintuitive principle that making learning slightly harder through spacing, interleaving, or retrieval practice dramatically improves long-term mastery. Our modern tools, for all their convenience, often shield us from this productive friction. Autocorrect fixes our spelling errors, search engines fill in our half-formed questions, and algorithms serve us bite-sized explanations before we've had time to grapple with the questions ourselves. Yet whispers of the old way persist. In a Tokyo lab, neuroscientists have found that students who practice slow reading, just 10 pages a day with deep annotation, outperform speed readers in comprehension and retention months later. Jesuit schools still teach a medieval technique called Lectio Divina, where texts are read at 4 different speeds, first for literal meaning, then for symbolic layers, then as prompts for reflection, finally as catalysts for contemplation. Even in Silicon Valley, some programmers swear by deep work rituals, channeling the monk's focus by disabling notifications and spending hours with a single problem. These aren't rejections of modernity, but corrections, ways to reclaim depth in a world obsessed with surface. The monk's legacy challenges our deepest assumptions about progress. They would find it bizarre that we measure intellectual growth by how much we consume rather than how well we've digested. In their world, to truly know something meant it had changed you, that you could reconstruct its logic in the dark, debate its nuances in your sleep, feel its truth in your bones. That kind of mastery can't be rushed, only cultivated. And in an age drowning in information but starved for wisdom, their patient approach feels less like a relic and more like a quiet rebellion, an invitation to build palaces in our minds, one slow, deliberate brick at a time. Recent breakthroughs in neuroscience are revealing an extraordinary side effect of memory palace techniques, their power to protect and heal the aging brain. In clinical trials across Europe and North America, older adults practicing these ancient methods show remarkable resilience against cognitive decline, with some studies reporting memory improvements equivalent to rolling back the clock by 10 years. When participants constructed mental palaces to remember grocery lists or family birthdays, MRI scans lit up with activity not just in memory centers, but in areas governing spatial reasoning, creativity, and even emotional processing. This full brain engagement creates what researchers call cognitive reserve, a buffer against deterioration that may delay Alzheimer's symptoms by years. The monks' daily rituals now appear startlingly modern through this lens. Their lifelong practice of mentally walking through scripture-filled cloisters wasn't just preserving knowledge, it was building neural scaffolding. Modern imaging shows that memory palace experts develop thicker gray matter in the hippocampus, that seahorse-shaped region ravaged by dementia. Like a workout strengthening muscles, regularly navigating mental spaces seems to fortify the brain's memory pathways. Neurologists compare it to having multiple backup routes when a main road collapses. Even if some neurons degenerate, the rich network of alternative connections keeps recall flowing. What's even more compelling are the unexpected psychological benefits emerging from recent studies. Depression and anxiety often accompany memory loss in aging, creating a vicious cycle where mental distress further impairs cognition. But participants using memory palaces report something unexpected, not just better recall, but brighter moods. The act of populating mental spaces with vivid, often whimsical images appears to stimulate the brain's reward centers. One 70-year-old trial participant described her memory palace as a playground for my mind, where recalling pharmacy medications meant revisiting a mental circus with acrobatic pill bottles performing trapeze acts. This playful engagement triggers dopamine release, transforming rote memorization from a chore into what one researcher called cognitive joyriding. The implications for dementia prevention are profound, where pharmaceutical interventions often target single neurological pathways. Memory palaces work like a symphony harmonizing visual, spatial, and emotional networks. Dr. Elena Martinez at UCLA's Longevity Center has documented cases where early-stage Alzheimer's patients regained lost vocabulary by placing words in childhood homes they could still vividly recall. The past becomes an anchor when the present starts slipping, she explains. We're finding that even severely damaged brains can sometimes access decades-old spatial memories, creating bridges to newer information. This renaissance of interest has led to innovative therapeutic hybrids. Some memory care facilities now guide residents in building reminiscence palaces, mental spaces filled with personal history instead of abstract facts. A retired teacher might arrange key life events along the halls of her imagined school, while a former gardener plants milestones among virtual rosebushes. These personalized versions honor the monk's core insight that memory thrives when tied to meaningful spaces while adapting it for modern neurological challenges. Perhaps the most poetic discovery is how these techniques echo across the lifespan. Just as medieval monks used memory palaces to preserve civilization's knowledge, modern practitioners are using them to safeguard individual minds against time's erosion. The same mental architecture that once held sacred texts now stores medication schedules and grandchildren's names, proving that this ancient art remains as vital as ever, not just for remembering the past but for protecting our future selves. Building your own memory palace begins not with grand ambitions, but with the floor plan of a place you know by heart, your childhood home, your daily commute, even the layout of your favorite coffee shop. The key is selecting a location so familiar you could navigate it blindfolded. Picture standing at your front door right now, that ceramic frog by the welcome mat. It's about to become the guardian of your grocery list, morphing into a dancing broccoli holding a milk carton like a scepter. The coat rack transforms into a spaghetti monster draped in scarves, reminding you to buy pasta. These aren't random absurdities, they're deliberate cognitive hooks. Neuroscience confirms that bizarre, emotionally charged images activate more brain regions than mundane ones, creating stickier memories. Start with just 5 loci-specific spots along a natural path through your chosen space. Your kitchen might offer a sequence. The fruit bowl becomes a locus for foreign vocabulary, a banana reciting French poetry. The stove dials represent math formulas, each burner emitting a different colored equation. The fridge handle holds a historical date, Cleopatra lounging on an ice cube. The trick is to engage all 5 senses. That lemon in your fruit bowl shouldn't just be visual, imagine its sharp scent, the waxy texture under your fingers, the tart zing when you bite into it. Multisensory encoding layers memory like varnish on wood. Practice is where the magic happens. Spend 2 minutes each night mentally strolling through your palace before sleep, a time when the brain consolidates memories most effectively. Notice how the dancing broccoli's movements become smoother, the spaghetti monster's scarf colors more vivid. These aren't just rehearsals, they're neural construction projects reinforcing synaptic pathways. One University of Chicago study found that participants who mentally traversed their memory palaces just 3 times could recall 95% of placed items a week later, compared to 30% retention with rote memorization. As confidence grows, expand strategically. Add a new wing, perhaps your office building's stairwell for periodic table elements, with each step representing an element that reacts dramatically. Hydrogen step fizzing like soda, the carbon step growing diamond vines. Advanced practitioners use nested loci. A bookshelf in your mental living room might contain miniature memory palaces within each book, allowing exponential storage. The technique scales beautifully. Memory champion Nelson Delys memorized 529 random digits in an hour by placing clusters in an imaginary version of his Miami neighborhood. Common pitfalls emerge when learners treat this as a passive storage system rather than an active relationship. A memory palace left unvisited for weeks will gather cognitive dust. Images fade like old photographs. The monk's secret wasn't just initial encoding, but the daily ritual of reinforcement. Modern apps like Memrise now incorporate spaced repetition algorithms to mimic this, prompting you to revisit lows, just as they're about to fade from memory. Adapt the system to your thinking style. Visual learners thrive on surreal imagery, while auditory types might assign soundtracks to lows, a boiling tea kettle sound for boiling points in chemistry. Kinesthetic learners physically trace their routes touching the real fruit bowl while visualizing the mental one. The method bends to your cognition like light through a prism. What begins as a tool for remembering shopping lists can evolve into something profound. One medical student transformed her apartment into a giant anatomy lab. The sofa became a beating heart with ventricles you could sink into. The chandelier, a branching nervous system. 2 years later, she credits this mental model for her surgical precision. When I make an incision, I'm not just recalling diagrams, I'm walking through rooms I know intimately. This is the monk's true legacy, not memory as storage, but memory as a living architecture that shapes how we engage with the world. Your palace awaits. All you need to bring is the willingness to see the extraordinary in the ordinary spaces you inhabit every day. One of the biggest traps for beginners is treating memory palaces like cluttered attics, jamming in too much too fast until the mental space becomes a chaotic jumble. Picture stuffing an entire semester's biology textbook into your childhood bedroom overnight. Mitochondria on the bed, taxonomy charts taped to the windows, the digestive system sprawled across the toy chest. The result, overwhelmed recall where nothing stands out clearly. Medieval monks avoided this by treating each locus like sacred ground, one striking image per nook, one concept per archway. A novice might spend weeks placing just a dozen psalms in their mental cloister, ensuring each had room to breathe. Modern research validates their restraint. Cognitive load theory shows working memory maxes out at about 4 novel items at once. Trying to cram 20 Spanish verbs onto a single mental bookshelf doesn't create fluency, it creates fog. Equally damaging is using weak, generic imagery. Visualizing a happy sun to remember the French word for sunshine, soleil, might seem sufficient, but it lacks the sticky specificity the monks mastered. Their memory palaces thrived on the bizarre and emotionally charged. A sun wearing a beret and sobbing into a handkerchief while peeling an onion. Soleil sounds like soleil, anchoring the sound through absurdity. The funnier or more grotesque the scene, the deeper it embeds. Neuroscience explains why unusual images trigger the amygdala, tagging memories as emotionally salient and routing them to long-term storage. A 2016 study in the Journal of Cognitive Enhancement found participants using vivid, idiosyncratic imagery recalled 3 times more information than those relying on bland visuals. Then there's the silent killer of memory palaces: neglect. Many beginners construct elaborate mental mansions only to abandon them after a single tour. Without regular revisits, those carefully placed associations crumble like frescoes in a ruined abbey. The monk's secret wasn't just initial encoding, but the rhythm of reinforcement. They integrated memory walks into daily rituals, reviewing loci during pre-dawn prayers, reinforcing images while copying manuscripts, even using mealtime chatter as retrieval practice. Modern memory athletes mirror this with spaced repetition algorithms, but the principle remains medieval. Memories solidify through cyclical engagement, not one-off effort. A University of Virginia study tracked language learners and found those who practiced recall just 3 times at spaced intervals outperformed crammers by 200% on long-term retention tests. The most subtle mistake, impatience with incremental growth. In our age of instant gratification, beginners often expect memory palaces to work like search engines, immediate, perfect recall. But the monks treated mastery as gradual cultivation. A 13th century Franciscan might spend a year building a modest mental chapel for basic liturgy before adding wings for advanced theology. This aligns with contemporary chunking theory, breaking complex information into manageable, interconnected clusters. Start small, 5 grocery items in your apartment's entryway. Master that, then expand to 10 vocabulary words in the living room. Like medieval scribes illuminating manuscripts, one ornate letter at a time, sustainable memory construction happens stroke by deliberate stroke. What separates successful practitioners isn't talent but strategy. Avoid the palace as dumpster approach, stuffing facts randomly into corners. Instead, emulate the monk's thematic organization, herbs and medicinal lore in the imaginary herb garden, astronomical knowledge in the celestial observatory. Group related concepts spatially, and you'll tap into the brain's innate love for patterns. A 2019 MIT study revealed that organized memory palace users developed spontaneous cognitive shortcuts, where recalling one item automatically triggered adjacent knowledge, like finding a cluster of related books shelved together. The monks' greatest lesson isn't archived in their techniques, but in their philosophy. Memory palaces aren't shortcuts, they're sanctuaries. Treat them with the care of a gardener tending rare orchids, prune overcrowded loci, refresh fading images, and always revisit with intention. In our rush to optimize learning, we've forgotten that some things can't be hurried. True mastery grows in the soil of patience, watered by repetition, and illuminated by the strange, glorious light of unforgettable imagery. Memory palaces aren't just relics of medieval monasteries, they're the secret weapons of modern mental athletes who perform feats that seem ripped from science fiction. At the World Memory Championships, competitors routinely memorize the order of 10 shuffled decks of cards in under an hour, or recall thousands of binary digits with perfect accuracy. These aren't savants with supernatural gifts. They're ordinary people who have mastered the same spatial techniques monks used to preserve sacred texts. Take Nelson Deleuze, a 4-time USA memory champion, who can memorize a deck of cards in under 40 seconds by visualizing each card as a vivid character placed along the streets of his Miami neighborhood. The Queen of Hearts becomes his grandmother baking heart-shaped cookies. The Ace of Spades transforms into a lumberjack carving a black tree. This isn't mere parlor trickery, it's the medieval art of los reborn for the digital age, proving that our brains haven't changed as much as we might think. The training regimens of these memory athletes would feel eerily familiar to a Benedictine monk, like medieval scribes methodically placing psalms in mental cloisters. Competitors spend months constructing elaborate imaginary landscapes. One might design a sprawling version of their college campus, assigning every building to a category, chemistry formulas in the science lab, historical dates in the lecture halls, grocery lists in the cafeteria. The more bizarre the imagery, the better. To remember that the Russian Revolution occurred in 1917, a competitor might picture Rasputin riding a giant, flaming number 17 like a rodeo bull through the campus library. This deliberate absurdity taps into the same cognitive principle the monks discovered. Our brains dismiss the mundane but cling fiercely to the outrageous. What's fascinating is how science now quantifies what the monks intuited. Brain scans of memory champions during competitions reveal fireworks of activity in the hippocampus and visual cortex, the same regions medieval practitioners would have strengthened through daily mental walks. Researchers at Radboud University found that after just 6 weeks of memory palace training, average subjects could double their recall capacity, with brain connectivity patterns beginning to resemble those of elite mnemonists. The monk's sacred discipline turns out to be neuroplasticity in action, proof that our neural pathways can be reshaped through deliberate spatial practice, whether to store theological treatises or the sequence of 1,000 playing cards. Yet there's a crucial difference between medieval and modern practitioners. For monks, memory palaces were sacred vessels meant to safeguard collective wisdom across generations. Today's memory athletes often treat them as personal playgrounds, tools for individual achievement rather than cultural preservation. This shift reflects our broader relationship with knowledge. Where monks saw memorization as devotional labor, we often view it as competitive sport. The irony is rich. The same technique once used to preserve civilization's fragile texts now helps contestants win trophies for recalling random number strings. The most compelling lessons emerge at the intersection of ancient and modern. Some competitors blend digital tools with medieval methods, using virtual reality headsets to construct limitless memory palaces with photorealistic detail. Others adapt monastic techniques for practical uses. Medical students like Alex Mullen, who became a 3-time world champion by applying memory palaces to anatomy studies, reported recalling complex nerve pathways during actual surgeries with eerie precision. Perhaps the future of this ancient art lies in synthesis, honoring the depth of the monk's approach while embracing new contexts where spatial memory can empower rather than just entertain. What endures across the centuries is the central revelation. The human mind, when given the right tools, remains capable of astonishing feats. Whether in a candlelit scriptorium or under the bright lights of a memory championship stage, the principle holds: true knowledge takes root most deeply when it has a home in the mind's eye. The monks would likely marvel at today's competitions, not for the speed or spectacle, but for the proof they offer, that even in our age of externalized memory, the palace gates still stand open, waiting for anyone willing to walk through. The echoes of memory palaces resonate far beyond monastery walls, weaving through the tapestry of Western culture in ways we seldom notice. Take the vibrant world of medieval heraldry. Those intricate coats of arms weren't just displays of nobility, but visual memory systems. A knight's shield might feature a lion for courage, a tower for steadfastness, and a winding river for strategic thinking, each element spatially arranged to tell a story at a glance. This wasn't mere decoration. It was a cousin to the monks' techniques, compressing complex lineages and virtues into unforgettable spatial symbols. Even the language of heraldry reveals this connection. Terms like dexter, right, and sinister left oriented descriptions as if the viewer were walking through a mental space. Then there's the Globe Theatre, where Shakespeare's actors performed without scripts, holding thousands of lines in their heads. The theatre's architecture may have been their secret weapon. Scholars like Dr. Lynette Hunter propose that the Globe's distinct sections, the heavens above, the trapdoor, hell below, and the 3-tiered galleries functioned as a physical memory palace. An actor playing Hamlet could associate to be or not to be with the upper balcony, the lofty realm of existential questions, while Ophelia's mad scenes might connect to the wildflowers strewn near the ground-level earth section. This spatial coding transformed the stage into a navigable mind map where movement triggered recall. The technique lives on today. Many actors still use blocking stage positioning to anchor lines, proving that performance memory has always been a spatial art. Our everyday speech betrays these ancient roots. When we say, "in the first place," or "on the other hand," we're unwittingly channeling the monk's spatial logic. These phrases aren't just idioms, they're fossils of a time when people literally placed arguments in mental locations. Even the word topic comes from the Greek topos, meaning place, revealing how deeply our cognition is wired to spatial metaphors. Modern presenters still talk about covering 3 points, visualizing ideas as objects arranged in space, unaware they're using a diluted form of the loci method. The most surprising survival might be in children's education. Montessori classrooms with their carefully zoned areas for math, language, and sensory activities unconsciously replicate memory palace principles. When a child associates subtraction with the red carpeted corner or grammar with the shelf of miniature objects, they're learning through spatial encoding, the same way a novice monk placed psalms in his imagined cloister. Modern researchers confirm this works. A 2021 study in the Journal of Educational Psychology found that students taught in spatially organized classrooms outperformed peers in recall tests by 38%. Perhaps the most poetic legacy lies in gardens, the memory gardens of the Renaissance, like the Sacro Bosco in Bamazzo, with its grotesque stone monsters, were physical memory palaces where each sculpture held symbolic meaning. Visitors would stroll past a dragon representing temptation, a tilting house symbolizing life's instability, each feature designed to imprint moral lessons through spatial experience. Today's therapeutic gardens for dementia patients use the same principle, arranging fragrant herbs and textured plants along winding paths to stimulate recall. The monks would nod in recognition their inner landscapes have blossomed into real ones, proving that memory, at its heart, has always been a kind of cultivation. These scattered fragments form a hidden genealogy, connecting illuminated manuscripts to theater balconies, heraldic shields to classroom rugs. They remind us that the art of memory was never just a technique, it was a way of seeing, one that shaped how we built stages, designed symbols, and even structured language itself. Palaces may have crumbled, but their blueprints linger in the unlikeliest places, waiting for us to recognize them. We live in an age of unprecedented access to knowledge, yet strangely, we remember less than ever before. The irony is palpable. With entire libraries available at our fingertips, our minds have become like sieves, letting information pour through without retaining much at all. This paradox has a name: digital amnesia, and it's the peculiar phenomenon where we forget what we can easily look up. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When we outsource memory to devices, we're not just losing facts, we're surrendering the very architecture of deep understanding. The medieval monks faced the opposite problem. In a world of scarce information, they had to make every scrap of knowledge count. Their solution, the memory palace, might be precisely what our distracted digital minds need most. Consider how we consume information today. We skim articles while checking notifications, watch videos at double speed, and bookmark pages we'll never revisit. This Buffett-style approach to learning leaves us overworked but undernourished, taking in mountains of content while absorbing almost nothing. Neuroscientists call this the illusion of competence, the false belief that because we've encountered information, we've learned it. The monks would have recognized this as spiritual and intellectual poverty. For them, true knowledge wasn't about exposure, it was about embodiment. When they placed a passage from scripture in their memory palace, they weren't just storing words, they were creating a relationship with those words, visiting them daily until the text reshaped how they thought and lived. The digital world thrives on distraction, but memory palaces demand focus, the kind of single-minded attention that's become rare in our multitasking era. Building a mental palace requires you to slow down, to sit with an idea long enough to give it space in your mind's architecture. There's no Control plus F function in a memory palace. You have to walk the halls, turn the corners, and engage with the material spatially and sensorially. This active recall strengthens neural pathways in ways passive scrolling never could. Studies at Princeton and UCLA found that students who took handwritten notes, a kinesthetic, spatially anchored process, consistently outperformed laptop users in conceptual understanding, not because they recorded more information, but because the physical act of selection and synthesis created deeper cognitive hooks. Perhaps most crucially, memory palaces combat what author Nicholas Carr calls the shallows, the fragmented thinking that comes from constant digital interruption. When knowledge exists as isolated factoids in a browser history, it rarely connects or accumulates into wisdom, but in a memory palace, everything has context. A scientific principle stored in your imagined kitchen doesn't float in isolation. It might connect to the chemical reactions happening on your mental stove, or the nutritional facts embedded in the fridge. This spatial organization mirrors how the brain naturally works, not as a filing cabinet, but as a web of interconnected associations. The monks didn't just memorize scripture, they understood how verses related to each other because those relationships were mapped in their mental spaces. There's also the matter of creative synthesis, the magic that happens when disparate ideas collide. In our digital workflows, we often keep topics siloed, work documents in one folder, personal projects in another, entertainment elsewhere. But in a memory palace, surprising juxtapositions occur naturally. A 14th century monk might find Augustine's theology brushing against Aristotle's logic simply because their locations shared a mental cloister. Modern innovators like Einstein and Tesla credited their breakthroughs to vivid mental visualization, essentially building memory palaces for abstract concepts. When Steve Jobs insisted that creativity is just connecting things, he was describing what monks had practiced for centuries, that true innovation flourishes when knowledge isn't just stored, but spatially arranged for unexpected encounters. The most compelling case for reviving this ancient art might be neurological. Brain scans show that frequent digital multitasking shrinks the gray matter in our anterior cingulate cortex, the area governing empathy and emotional control. Meanwhile, memory palace techniques light up the hippocampus like a Christmas tree while strengthening connections to the visual cortex. Essentially, we're exercising the parts of our brains most vulnerable to digital atrophy. Psychologists at the University of London found that just 6 weeks of memory training reversed attention span decline in chronic media multitaskers, proof that our plastic brains can rebound from digital overload when given the right tools. This isn't about rejecting technology, it's about reclaiming cognitive sovereignty. Imagine a hybrid approach where we use digital tools to gather information, then memory palaces to deeply internalize what matters. A medical student might watch anatomy videos at double speed, then spend quality time placing those structures in a meticulously constructed mental operating room. A programmer could quickly scan documentation online, then anchor key algorithms to loci in an imagined tech campus. The monks didn't shun external aids. They copied manuscripts painstakingly by hand before committing them to memory. Their genius was in recognizing that true mastery lies at the intersection of external resources and internal cultivation. The digital age won't be undone, nor should it be. But as we navigate this ocean of information, we might take a lesson from those medieval guardians of wisdom that the antidote to overload isn't more storage, but better architecture. Our devices remember everything and understand nothing. The monk's legacy reminds us that real wisdom begins where external storage ends, in the sacred space of a mind trained to hold, connect, and truly know. Their crumbling parchment may have been replaced by cloud servers, but the human brain remains the most extraordinary storage device ever created. If only we'd furnish it with palaces instead of letting it become a warehouse of forgotten bookmarks. Dr. Jane Smith's laboratory at Cambridge looks nothing like a medieval scriptorium. Sleek monitors display real-time brain scans instead of parchment, and the air hums with the quiet pulse of fMRI machines. But when she describes how memory palaces work, the gap between ancient and modern collapses. The hippocampus doesn't care if a space is real or imagined. She explains, pointing to a scan where vibrant neural pathways light up like cathedral-stained glass. When test subjects construct memory palaces, we see the same brain regions activate as when they navigate their childhood homes. This isn't just memorization, it's cognitive time travel. Her research reveals something extraordinary. Spatial memory techniques don't just improve recall, they rewire the brain. Frequent practitioners develop thicker gray matter in the hippocampus, the same region that atrophies in Alzheimer's patients. Medieval monks essentially stumbled upon the ultimate neuroplasticity workout, she says. Their daily mental walks through scripture-filled cloisters were like weightlifting for neural connections. Across the Atlantic, memory athlete John Doe demonstrates this ancient power with startling modern flair. On stage at the World Memory Championships, he recalls a shuffled deck of cards in under 30 seconds, a feat that seems supernatural until he pulls back the curtain. Every card is a character in my mental neighborhood, he explains. The 7 of diamonds is my neighbor Frank washing his car with diamond-shaped soap bubbles. When I need to recall the sequence, I just take a walk down my street. His training regimen would make a medieval monk nod in approval. Hours spent visualizing elaborate scenes in precise locations, transforming abstract data into vivid spatial stories. But there's a crucial difference. Where monks use these techniques to preserve sacred texts, Doe competes in events requiring rapid-fire recall of random numbers, names, and binary digits. The method hasn't changed, he admits. Only the purpose has. We're not preserving civilization anymore, we're pushing the limits of what the brain can do under pressure. The intersection of their worlds, neuroscience labs, and memory competitions reveals an unexpected truth. Dr. Smith's studies show that memory athletes like Doe don't inherently have better brains. They've simply trained them to access latent capabilities we all possess. In one landmark experiment, she scanned the brains of novice subjects before and after 6 weeks of memory palace training. The results were staggering. Not only did their recall abilities skyrocket, but their brain connectivity patterns began resembling those of elite mnemonists. This isn't about talent, she emphasizes. It's about tapping into evolutionary wiring. Our ancestors didn't need to remember phone numbers. They needed to recall which bend in the river had fresh water or where the berry bushes thrived. Memory palaces speak the brain's native language. Doe's experience echoes this democratizing potential. My first memory palace was my elementary school, he recalls. I placed the periodic table there for a chemistry exam, hydrogen balloons in the entrance hall, helium voices squeaking near the lockers. Suddenly, rote memorization became an adventure. What began as a study hack evolved into something profound. During competitions, he describes entering a flow state where time distorts, a sensation medieval mystics might have called contemplatio. When you're deep in a well-constructed palace, recall feels less like retrieval and more like walking through a familiar place where everything has its home. Their combined insights expose a paradox of modern education. Dr. Smith notes with dismay how schools prioritize cramming over deep encoding, despite overwhelming evidence that spatial techniques yield better long-term retention. We're teaching kids to memorize the way computers store data sequentially and abstractly, when their brains are wired for something completely different. Doe encounters this firsthand when teaching memory workshops to college students. Their jaws drop when they realize they can memorize 100 foreign vocabulary words in an hour by placing them in their dorm rooms instead of staring at flashcards. It feels like hacking, but it's just biology. The most compelling convergence lies in therapeutic applications. Dr. Smith now collaborates with dementia clinics, adapting monastic memory techniques to help patients anchor fading memories in lifelong spatial knowledge. A grandmother might not remember her medication schedule, but she can recall every corner of her childhood farmhouse. We help her place pill bottles in the mental barn, doctor's appointments by the tractor. Doe volunteers at these sessions, bringing an athlete's precision to the monk's compassionate mission. Watching a war veteran with early Alzheimer's recall grandchildren's names by placing them in his old army barracks, both scientist and memory champion see the full circle, an ancient art reborn as modern medicine. Their work proves that memory palaces aren't relics but living tools. Whether used to win competitions, combat cognitive decline, or simply remember where you left your keys, these techniques endure because they honor how our brains evolved, not as filing cabinets, but as vast, imaginative landscapes where every idea can find a home. In a world drowning in information but starving for wisdom, the collaboration between lab coats and mental athletes suggests a radical possibility. The best way forward might be to revisit the past. The rhythmic breathing of a monk memorizing scripture in a candlelit cloister and the measured inhales of a modern office worker using a mindfulness app might seem worlds apart, but they share a profound kinship. Both are engaged in the sacred act of attention, the deliberate focusing of the mind's full capacity on a single point. The monks didn't just build memory palaces to store facts, they constructed them as sanctuaries for undistracted presence. Each mental stroll through their imagined corridors required the same quality of focus that today's mindfulness teachers call single-pointed awareness, the ability to anchor the wandering mind to the present moment. When a Benedictine brother placed a psalm in his mental choir stall, he wasn't merely encoding information, he was practicing a form of cognitive stillness, training his mind to dwell fully in the act of remembrance without the static of distraction. This intersection of memory and mindfulness reveals something unexpected about how our brains engage with knowledge. Contemporary studies at Harvard Medical School show that mindfulness meditation strengthens the same neural pathways used in spatial memory techniques: the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, and the default mode network. It's as if the monks intuited a biological truth centuries before fMRI machines could confirm it. That deep learning requires deep presence. When subjects in a 2022 study practiced mindfulness before attempting memory palace techniques, their retention rate soared by nearly 40% compared to control groups. The explanation lies in attention's gatekeeping role. Without focused awareness, information slips through the mind like sand through fingers. The parallels run deeper than neuroscience. Both traditions view the mind as a space to be cultivated rather than a vessel to be filled. Just as monks saw their memory palaces as sacred architecture requiring daily maintenance, mindfulness practitioners speak of tending their awareness like a garden, weeding out distractions, nurturing focus, and creating intentional space for what matters. This shared metaphor of mental cultivation hints at an ancient wisdom. True mastery of the mind isn't about passive absorption, but active stewardship. A 14th century Carthusian monk reviewing his mental loci and a modern executive pausing to observe her breath during a hectic day are both engaging in the same fundamental act, stepping back from the torrent of thoughts to consciously direct their cognitive resources. Yet there's a crucial distinction in their aims. For monks, memory training was ultimately in service of transcendence, a way to internalize sacred texts until recitation became prayer. until the words on their lips became unity with the divine. Modern mindfulness often pursues a more grounded goal: stress reduction, productivity, or emotional regulation, but the bridge between them is the quality of attention they foster. When you walk through a memory palace, whether to recall a grocery list or a Gregorian chant, you're forced into a state of hyper-awareness, noticing every detail of your imagined surroundings. This mirrors the mindfulness practice of noting, where one observes thoughts and sensations without judgment. Both create a mental environment where focus isn't just possible, but inevitable. The most compelling convergence may be in their shared resistance to modernity's fragmentation. In an age of perpetual multitasking and digital distraction, both traditions offer an antidote: the radical notion that some things deserve our undivided attention. The monk's patient memorization stands as a quiet rebuke to our skimming culture, just as mindfulness challenges the myth that productivity means doing more things simultaneously. Researchers at Stanford's Attention Lab have found that heavy media multitaskers, those most entrenched in modern digital habits, perform significantly worse on memory tests than their focused counterparts. The implications are startling. Our very ability to remember may depend on our capacity to be present. Perhaps this is why memory palace techniques are experiencing a renaissance among mindfulness practitioners. Apps like Memorado now blend spatial memory exercises with meditation timers, while neuroscientist-turned-memory coach Boris Conrad teaches Silicon Valley executives to combine loci methods with mindful breathing. The hybrid approach makes biological sense when we anchor information to mental spaces while in a state of relaxed focus. We're essentially bookmaking knowledge with both cognitive and emotional tags, making retrieval more effortless. A lawyer might place key arguments along the path of her morning jogging route, then revisit them during mindful walking meditation, weaving memory and presence into a single practice. The monk's legacy whispers a challenge to our fractured digital lives: that true knowledge isn't just acquired but received, with patience, with presence, with the full weight of our attention. Their memory palaces weren't just storage devices, they were temples to undistracted thought. In a world where the average attention span has shrunk to less than a goldfish's, perhaps the most radical thing we can do is follow their example, to build inner sanctuaries where focus can dwell, and where what we choose to remember becomes part of who we aspire to be. One of the biggest misconceptions about memory palaces is that they are some kind of secret weapon for the genetically gifted, that only people with so-called photographic memories can harness their power. Nothing could be further from the truth. The monks who perfected this technique weren't born with supernatural recall. They trained their minds through disciplined, daily practice. Think of it like learning to play the piano. No one expects to sit down and flawlessly perform a concerto on their first try. It takes time, repetition, and patience. Memory palaces work the same way. Modern neuroscience confirms this. Brain scans show that after just 6 weeks of consistent practice, ordinary people develop neural pathways similar to those of elite memorizers. The skill isn't in your genes, it's in your willingness to build mental architecture brick by brick. Another persistent myth suggests memory palaces are just glorified filing cabinets, tools for dry, mechanical memorization of facts and figures. But the monks knew better. When they placed scripture in their imagined cloisters, they weren't creating sterile databases. They were constructing dynamic theaters of the mind where ideas could interact. This process naturally sparks creativity. Take a 12th century scribe memorizing a biblical parable about seeds. By visualizing those seeds as glowing embers in his mental herb garden, each one sprouting into a different theological concept, he wasn't just recalling the story. He was remixing it, discovering new layers of meaning through vivid spatial metaphors. Contemporary research backs this up. A 2020 study in the Journal of Creative Behavior found that participants using memory palaces generated 40% more innovative solutions to problems than those relying on traditional note-taking. The act of linking disparate concepts in imagined spaces mirrors how breakthrough ideas form through unexpected connections. Perhaps the most limiting belief is that memory palaces have rigid rules, that there's a right way to construct them. In reality, the technique is gloriously adaptable. A graphic designer might populate her mental palace with explosive splashes of color to remember marketing data, while a musician could assign musical motifs to different rooms. The medieval monks themselves constantly personalized their methods. One might use the scent of incense to tag philosophical texts, while another relied on the tactile memory of rosary beads under his fingers. Modern memory champion Yenjo Wintersoul memorized the entire IKEA catalog by turning product categories into whimsical characters. A bookshelf with legs running a marathon, a lamp serenading a sofa. The only limit is your imagination's willingness to play. What these myths reveal is our tendency to mystify ancient wisdom or pigeonhole it as outdated. The truth is far more exciting. Memory palaces aren't relics or party tricks, they're evidence of our brain's astonishing plasticity. Every time you place a grocery list on an imaginary kitchen counter or nestle a client's name in the branches of your childhood treehouse, you're not just remembering. You're participating in a centuries-old dialogue about what the human mind can achieve when we stop doubting its potential and start building rooms for it to grow. We stand at a crossroads where artificial intelligence promises to remember everything for us: our schedules, passwords, even the names of casual acquaintances. Digital assistants archive our conversations, cloud storage hoards our photos, and search engines stand ready to retrieve any fact in milliseconds. On the surface, this seems like liberation, our brains freed from the drudgery of rote memorization. But the monk's legacy asks us to consider the hidden cost of this outsourcing. What happens when we stop exercising our capacity to remember? Like a muscle that atrophies from disuse, our neural pathways for deep retention weaken when we habitually rely on external storage. Studies at the University of California reveal that habitual use of GPS shrinks the hippocampus, the very region medieval monks strengthened through their memory palace practice. The irony is stark. We've built tools to compensate for memory limitations, only to discover those tools may accelerate the decline they were meant to offset. Yet dismissing technology outright would be equally short-sighted. The question isn't whether we should use digital tools, but how to integrate them with ancient wisdom. Consider the paradox of accessibility. While cloud storage makes information universally available, it also makes us vulnerable. A single data breach can expose a lifetime of personal memories stored in digital vaults. Power outages render smart devices useless, leaving those dependent on them cognitively stranded. The monks faced no such fragility. Their mental libraries required no electricity, no passwords, no permissions. Modern memory athletes have found a middle path, using apps to train their minds rather than replace them. Anki, a popular flashcard program, combines spaced repetition algorithms with the monk's principle of vivid imagery, letting users build digital memory palaces reinforced by neuroscientist-approved timing. The deeper philosophical dilemma lies in how external storage changes our relationship with knowledge. There's a qualitative difference between recalling a poem from your mental palace and pulling it up on a screen. One is an act of embodiment, the other of retrieval. When a monk internalized scripture, it became part of his intellectual and spiritual fabric, available for spontaneous reflection or creative recombination. By contrast, studies at Columbia University found that when people know information is saved externally, They remember where to find it rather than the information itself, a phenomenon called the Google effect. This isn't inherently bad, it's cognitive offloading, but it does alter how deeply we engage with ideas. Emerging technologies might bridge this divide. Virtual reality headsets now allow users to construct three-dimensional memory palaces with photorealistic detail, blending ancient techniques with cutting-edge interfaces. Imagine walking through a VR recreation of your childhood home, where quantum physics formulas glow on the refrigerator and historical timelines unfold across the living room walls. These hybrid approaches honor the monk's insight that spatial memory is our cognitive superpower, while leveraging modern tools to overcome the limitations of pure imagination. Some neurotech startups are even experimenting with brain-computer interfaces that could one day let us download information directly into our mental palaces, though this raises profound questions about what it means to truly know something. The monk's most enduring lesson may be about intentionality. They didn't memorize indiscriminately, but with sacred purpose, selecting texts worthy of deep internalization. In our age of infinite digital accumulation, we might adopt a similar discernment. Perhaps we'll reserve our mental palaces for what matters most: the poetry that moves us, the scientific principles that shape our worldview, the personal memories that define us, while letting machines handle mundane data. This selective approach reflects how memory athletes operate today, using spatial techniques primarily for specialized knowledge or competitive feats, not everyday trivia. Looking ahead, the limitations of technology may paradoxically revive interest in mental retention. As AI-generated content floods the internet, verifying truth becomes increasingly difficult unless we've internalized enough baseline knowledge to spot inconsistencies. Cybersecurity threats make sensitive information safer in our minds than on servers. Even the environmental cost of data storage, those energy-hungry server farms, might one day make cerebral archiving the greener choice. The future likely holds not the obsolescence of memory, but its redefinition, less about storing facts and more about cultivating wisdom, with technology and tradition working in concert. What the monks understood, and what we're rediscovering, is that memory isn't just storage, it's identity. The texts they internalized didn't just reside in their minds, they shaped how those minds worked. In an era of algorithmic curation and fragmented attention, rebuilding our capacity for deep retention might be the most radical way to reclaim autonomy over our own thoughts. The path forward isn't rejecting tools but mastering them, using technology not as a crutch but as a whetstone to sharpen the blade of our innate abilities. After all, the greatest palaces aren't those built to shelter us from challenge, but those that inspire us to reach higher. The fading art of memory palaces whispers a profound truth about what we've sacrificed in our rush toward convenience. Those medieval monks pacing their cloisters weren't just preserving texts, they were safeguarding a fundamental human capacity, one that modern neuroscience is only beginning to fully appreciate. When they visualized scripture in imagined corridors, they were tapping into something far more powerful than rote memorization. They were engaging the brain's natural navigation system, turning dry words into multisensory experiences that could last a lifetime. Today, as we drown in notifications and half-read articles, their approach feels less like ancient history and more like a lifeline, a way to reclaim focus, depth, and meaning in how we learn. What makes their legacy so vital isn't just the technique itself, but what it reveals about the mind's untapped potential. Consider the humble beginnings of a memory palace, just a familiar place, a handful of vivid images, and the willingness to walk through it mentally. Yet from these simple ingredients, ordinary people achieve extraordinary feats. A medical student memorizes every muscle in the human body by placing them in an imaginary dissection lab. A language learner fluent in Mandarin recalls thousands of characters by turning them into animated creatures living in her childhood home. These aren't party tricks, they're proof that our brains are wired for spatial storytelling, waiting for us to unlock that latent ability. The monks would likely marvel at our modern memory athletes, but they might also ask a piercing question. What are we choosing to remember? In an era where algorithms feed us endless content, their disciplined approach to knowledge, selecting only what deserved sacred space in the mind, feels revolutionary. They didn't clutter their palaces with trivia, they curated wisdom, letting each memorized passage reshape their understanding of the world. There's a lesson here for our information-saturated age. Perhaps real intelligence isn't about how much we can access, but how deeply we can integrate what truly matters. Imagine applying that discernment today. Instead of skimming 20 articles on climate change, we might select one seminal paper and embed it in our mental architecture, walking through its arguments like rooms in a house, noticing how the evidence connects across corridors of thought. Rather than forgetting a podcast 5 minutes after listening, we could place its key insights along our daily commute, revisiting them until they alter how we see our work or relationships. This shift from consumption to embodiment could transform learning from a passive act into an active, even transformative practice. The most hopeful sign lies in how these ancient methods are being rediscovered where they're needed most. Elementary schools in Sweden experiment with memory palaces to help dyslexic students spell complex words by visualizing them as quirky neighbors on a street. Retirement communities use spatial techniques to combat dementia, helping residents anchor fading memories to lifelong mental landmarks. Even Silicon Valley technologists, those high priests of digital disruption, are turning to loci methods to manage overwhelming workloads. The thread connecting these modern adopters to medieval monks isn't nostalgia, it's the recognition that some human challenges transcend technology. As we stand at the intersection of artificial intelligence and cognitive science, the monks' wisdom takes on new urgency. Yes, we have tools they couldn't dream of: virtual reality memory palaces, apps that gamify spatial learning, but the core truth remains unchanged. Knowledge sticks when it has a home in the mind's eye. The future of memory isn't about choosing between silicon and synapses, but about weaving them together wisely. Let the machines handle our calendars and shopping lists. Reserve the palaces within us for what changes who we are. So the next time you forget where you left your keys, consider this. The problem isn't your memory, it's how you're using it. Our ancestors built civilizations with the same brains we have today. They just knew how to furnish them differently. In reviving their art, we're not stepping backward. We're reclaiming a birthright, the ability to carry whole worlds inside us, to think in layers and connections, to remember not just with our devices, but with our whole being. The monks' greatest gift wasn't the texts they saved, but the proof they left behind, that the human mind, properly trained, remains the most extraordinary technology of all.